today. And we're going to talk about the COVID-19 situation and talk about the number of cases and where the economy may be going from the national perspective first. And then we're going to talk about the California situation and what indicators might tell a story about where things may be going. And then also just thinking about how businesses are going to come back from this. So thinking about Modoc County as an example of that, where are the jobs locally going to be at risk? And there's not an enormous number of jobs in Modoc County, which is true of most rural counties in California. But just thinking about where there might be some issues, and then ultimately thinking also about housing. So if you think about the two things that usually are the foundations of a community, the jobs and their availability, and then people staying in their homes and remaining rooted that provide workers for those jobs locally, the combination of those two are very much in the mind of municipal leaders. And so that's something to think about as we go forward. And then finally, I'll stop at the end and talk about some of the things to watch in terms of the indicators and how social policy may start lifting and us getting back to some normal way of doing business. We're looking at the cases in the United States. We've seen this evolution. This started on March 1, where this scale ticked up and started to increase at an increasing scale, and then has been slowly increasing at a decreasing scale in the United States, but it's been a very slow, long movement in terms of how long it's been in trying to get the cases to get to the top of the hill. That's the critical part of the process, folks, in terms of getting the economy turned back on. It's just getting this curve to the top of the hill and actually falling down the other side. And that's something that we're all watching very closely. This is the last 7 days, 5 days ago or so. You can see each day sort of marching along, not a lot of ascension, but still there in slight form. Here's our equity markets. And the thing about the equity markets to watch is what happened after the 1st of March is that very top. So 3277 is where we topped out. And this is the S&P 500 from January 2000. So it shows the last two recessions, which you'll see in a minute. And you can see what happened to the S&P 500 after both those recessions began. And you can see the slide. The dot-com recession, the one on the far left-hand side, is much different in terms of the speed at which the market fell apart than in the Great Recession episode, the shaded area in the middle. The outlined area on the far right is what's happened just since basically February 28. And if you see that downturn, that is the sharpest downturn in 1 month we've ever seen in the market, really, of any kind, with respect to percentage change in 1 month. Even in the Great Depression, it was very close. But we've come back. And so the beauty of it is it's been a quick episode. And if you think about it, this seems like it came on in a hurry, but then we've also been trying to solve problems in a hurry, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We're still way down from the market lows as we came out of the Great Recession. So one of the things that's been very tricky is the month of March was kind of dominated by equity market movements. The months of April and May are probably going to be dominated by job movements in terms of job downturn. And I'll talk about that now. One of the data points we're watching at the US level, because it's really a good indicator of what's going to happen at the state and ultimately the county level, is what we call new unemployment claim or new initial claims for unemployment insurance. And I'm going to show this on a quarterly average of weekly data, because for the US and for California, the data do come out on a weekly average or on a weekly clip. The trick in that is that 1 week can be very episodic. And so economists don't like to just look at one data point and say, okay, this is the new trend. That's not a very smart way of playing. We like to look at sort of a rolling average of data as we can, as long as they are over a so-called time series. And since these data are from 1986 to just the first couple weeks of April 2020, we could look at them in sort of 12-week averages, or what I call here quarterly averages. But this is the number of people that actually have asked for unemployment to start. So here's the US. After you see the 3 recessions since 1986, that's the US number. So you can see that unemployment insurance claims that are new roll up toward the middle of the recession and then slide back down. In other words, they want to go up. People who see themselves as out of work or have jobs that they lose over time, once the initial surge happens, that peaks. And when that peaks, that does begin good things in our economy. Notice that as those peaks are hit and then we start to slide down, the recession ends and we go back to a more normal economic period. Well, you can see on the far right-hand side, that blue line surged north and is going to continue to do that probably for the next couple of weeks in this rolling quarterly average. But that tells us that unemployment is going to rise and that we should expect some labor market problems along the way here the next couple of months minimum. And we're watching for that to peak, a la what's happened in the past. Now, in contrast, this is California. California has a little bit more seasonal movement to it, but you can see also that there were peaks hit after each recession or during in some cases, and that on the far right-hand side, we've also seen a surge. Another way of looking at employment or unemployment is the number of hours worked on average every week. And so I'm going to show you data, and you can see an outline part that's going to show up in just a second, from March 2007 to March 2020, which is going to roll around the US average in terms of percentage change. And so watch this. That dotted line is 0, meaning that some weeks it's a little above the average and sometimes it's a little bit below the average. And I'm going to show you in 7 different ways to think about the number of hours on average worked per week. This is the US average since 2007 on a monthly basis, averaging out the weeks in the month. And percentage change wise, you can see the Great Recession. You can see the downturn on the left-hand side, it going back up. And then basically we're sort of rolling around the percentage change of 0. Why? Because when people establish their work week, they usually don't change it that much. And so we are looking for really quick changes in the hours worked to either signal that people are being hired and more productivity is happening than we normally would have. Or when we see it go down, we're concerned that people are starting to see reduced hours. We're going to have reduced productivity and income and ultimately have fewer jobs. So you can see on the far right-hand side where I have that shaded area, the US average has gone down a little bit, but was sort of slipping a little bit as we were going into this year and actually at the end of last year anyway. And a lot of that was creating an outlook of a slowing economy. Well, watch this. Here's retail with the average contrasted. And you can see retail actually had picked up after some time of sliding down. So part of that down, let's say the far right-hand side where you see it below the dotted line, suggested retail was going to be struggling to continue to be as productive as it had before. And that's because retail was contracting in the United States. It has picked up. A lot of that's because we've moved our lives from one in which we're moving around a lot and buying an enormous number of goods to something that's relatively grocery retail oriented for the time being. This is manufacturing. You see manufacturing had slid a little bit last year, again, leading to an outlook for a slower moving economy, and slid a little bit, basically driving and also following the US average. Here's construction. Construction is more episodic, some of it's seasonal, but we had seen all kinds of hour movements, but basically revolving around 0, which means not much change, just some seasonal movements. Here's professional services, same type of deal. Here's transportation and warehousing. You can see that this may provide you some irony that actually transportation and warehousing had slid a little bit because while we have been ordering more things online, those companies are trying to reduce their costs in terms of the number of workers they have and the amount of time that people are on the road moving those goods from their warehousing to you. And so that had slid a little bit in 2019, and we expected that industry to slow down a little bit in terms of the number of people that they were using and the number of hours that they were requiring, which is exactly what happened. You notice the period, let's say between 2017 and 2019, it had picked up. Now, that's a precursor to what I'm going to show you next, because what I'm going to show you next has 2 parts to it. One, it really shows you how the recession has hurt one industry specifically, which is hotels and restaurants, but how deep the hurt has been. Watch this. You can see that the hours worked in hotels and restaurants, our final industry breakdown, is a sharp decline. That means that hotels and restaurants are likely to be the first into our economic issues that we're about to see, and maybe the last out. And there's our US average again. So what's happened is a tale of 3 policies. And those 3 policies have led to a bunch of different angles on what's going to happen in the United States economy going forward. So they're really the combination of monetary and fiscal policy, the reaction in interest rates, monetary, the amazingly large spending packages coming out of Congress for both businesses and households, fiscal policy, and then us staying at home or being asked to do so and restricting our movement and ultimately restricting our economic activity, which is social policy. The combination of monetary and fiscal policy is supposed to be positive. The social policy is negative, and right now much larger than the 2 policies otherwise combined. We're expecting those policies to have a larger effect over the next few months as the social policy begins to fade. But at the end of the day, folks, we're in the situation we've been in since mid-February as a reaction and a tail of 3 policies combined. And it has been an amazing run in terms of going from not a whole lot happening to an amazing change to an amazing policy reaction by Congress and the Federal Reserve, all of which happened in about 50 days, which in the Great Recession took almost 18 months to come to full fruition. So think about 18 months Great Recession, really tough time. 50 days this time, a little over 7 weeks. What did the fiscal policy have inside of it? Well, a lot of it was about keeping businesses open, or at least alive, and workers in their jobs. So extended eligibility for workers across the board, extended those that had health issues and just putting them into unemployment insurance if they lost their job based on COVID-19 or some other issues related to COVID-19. We're also saw an expansion of assistance in terms of how long folks are going to be on unemployment insurance potentially and the amount they're getting. And what that's done is it's led to a natural opportunity cost. Is when you give people money for not working based on what they paid in unemployment taxes and you augment that benefit, you may augment it in such a way it makes them very tricky to rehire workers, especially low wage workers. So in Modoc County, wages are relatively low versus the state average. And it's something to watch, that if we start to see the economy turn around and workers are now on unemployment, how tough it is for your local businesses to actually rehire those workers, given what they might get over the next 6 or 9 months. A bunch of business loans, which are headline makers right now, have come out, and we saw the first tranche completely used up, and the second one is now on the way and will fund in some business cases. But there's all kinds of rules. Be sure to talk to your SBA lender about the exact rule book for the loan you're getting. Do not assume anything in terms of it turning into a grant, what you need to do to turn it into a grant, the timing of all that. Be sure to talk to your lender and have those stipulations nailed in your mind if you're receiving these loans as a business owner. And finally, the public sector is also going to get a lot of help. But as a public worker myself, one of the things I'm concerned at is that we're hearing a lot of rhetoric about the money coming in, but we've also had a lot of cost. So whether or not the federal funding that will come in for the public sector will simply just fill the hole created by COVID-19, or will actually help not only fill that hole, but provide us to make some investments in what we need to do to completely get out of it, is still an open question. I'm kind of faulting on the side that it might just fill the hole, because history suggests that when the federal government provides money to states, counties, and cities, it usually is with an estimate of what is the bare minimum to get done, because counties, cities, and states don't vote. People do. And so that's why we're seeing most of the money move toward households directly or indirectly. One of the questions I get asked a lot, especially after the governor's speech recently, about what the conditions were going to be in terms of reopening the economy, was what are the costs and benefits of opening a little too early? So the costs are that we would reinfect or have some health case or some health system overloads. And that's something to watch very closely. And that really is probably at the forefront of the governor's mind in all 50 states, watching to make sure we don't have a reinfection. In the medium term, if you open too early, you might have another economic slowdown, and it may be more specific to your area, because the other area might restrict movements from your area. If you reinfect, let's say Nevada and California open at the same time, but California should not have opened. Nevada may say, we don't want visitors from California, because even though it'd be good for our economy, we don't want the reverberative effects of being reinfected ourselves. So that can lead to some more negative economic impacts. And then finally, in the long term, if you open up too early, the cost of doing business might rise even more, and there's going to be some restrictive policies about how we roll out in the current scenario, assuming we do it right, for business, and it might actually lead to more structural change in our economy, which is the one thing we're trying to avoid. The benefits of opening are that we do get our jobs and our spending back started and our tax revenues flowing. So the hope is when we reopen, we time it such that the costs are minimized and the benefits are maximized, which is sort of classic economics, but that's what we're hoping for. In the medium term, we're sort of betting on no repeat of the virus, or that if it does come back, we're going to be able to combat it more completely. And in the long term, hopefully, and this is one of the very positive outcomes, because when there's a lot of negative, just like anything else, there's a benefit that's sitting out there as the alternative. And that is, you're going to probably see some adaptation and some innovation come in and help create situations or create workplace environments or create vaccines that will be very good at controlling the symptoms and or controlling the problem if we see it come back. Okay, so as sort of a middle point of our conversation here today, I want to say that depth and duration is the key. So what we're most concerned about as economists are the depth of the problem, how many people lose their jobs, how many businesses we lose, how many additional jobs that means, and how do governments in our municipalities suffer as a result of this, and how long is that going to be? We know there's going to be some pain, and we're already experiencing that pain. The key now is to minimize the depth and sort of minimize the duration. That's the game we're playing. We don't want this to linger long, even if it's a small amount of pain. The last thing we want to do is have it linger for 2 or 3 years if we can help it, and we don't want it severely deep. So We're going to spend most of the rest of the time today talking about California and Modoc County. Here is the US and California contrasted in terms of unemployment rates. This is from 1976 forward, which means there's 5 recessions. There's the US unemployment rate showing you how high things got when trouble came, and in a sense, how we got out of it in terms of the jobs that we created. And you can see that on the far right-hand side, the Great Recession had an extremely quick movement up, and then a pretty long slide down, but a good slide, and we got back to square basically after 2012. This is California. Similar movement, which makes sense. California somewhat drives what happens in the US economy and also is driven by it. So they're related to each other, but you can see the difference between the red line and the black line, meaning the difference between the US and California unemployment rates. California tends to have a little bit more unemployment. It's a little bit more exposed to risk and obviously also exposed to return when job markets are good, like they have been the last few years. There's the dot-com recession. There is the Great Recession. And those are giving you some contrast as to how the economy's reacted in both those scenarios. And generally speaking, those 2 recessions are probably the most germane to where we're going to be the next few months, but we will see. But think about that in terms of the evolution of our economy when you start hearing data about unemployment. You can see that the last month we saw a little kick, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Here's unemployment, the unemployment rate, and also unemployment insurance claims contrasted with each other. So the left-hand axis is the percentage of people unemployed that are in the labor force, and the right-hand axis is the annual change in unemployment insurance claims. And you're going to see something that hopefully will give us some way of predicting. The black line are unemployment insurance claims. We talked about their importance before as telling us that unemployment is coming. And you can see that the peak of the unemployment rate for California, the blue line, and the black line, which is the claims to begin unemployment, are contrasted from each other in time. And that makes sense in the sense that people lose their jobs, then they get unemployment insurance, and then there's some sorting out in the economy because not as many people who claim unemployment end up remaining on unemployment. And we peak over time to the point where those claims no longer are needed. You can see the black lines begins to drop down as unemployment peaks and then begins to drop down. And then we kind of get into some balance on both sides. So what I have outlined right now is the Gulf War I recession. That's the dot-com recession. And then that's the Great Recession in terms of the peak to peak movement. So in those 3 recessions, the peaks of these data were about 24 months contrasted at the maximum and about 20 at the minimum. But it took about 1.5 years for all the movement in unemployment to actually play itself out in the economy where we actually started growing again. And that's the key. How long does it take from the signals we're getting that are at least supposed to be leading signals of where we're headed to the time in which we actually feel like the economy's gone through what it's going to go through as an employment cycle and start to get better? This is Modoc County. And there's only one example given the data we have on these two data sets, but the left-hand axis in this case is the actual physical number of people that went in and asked for unemployment insurance. And the blue line is, then the right-hand axis is the percentage of unemployment. And you can see that the unemployment rate, which is in black this time, was relatively high, peaking out at just about 17% in Modoc County, but has drifted down to somewhere under 8% since the Great Recession. The blue line is the data I just showed you in terms of California. You can see it peaked in late 2010 and before unemployment peaked in late 2011. So about 9 months difference between those 2 peaks. Why is that important? Well, we now have data that's starting to show a rise in the unemployment claims in Modoc County. And we knew this was coming. So what we want to do is be very watchful to see when those new unemployment insurance claims peak, because that might tell us within 1 year, we're getting to the top of the hill in Modoc County. Well, we will see. Where are some vulnerable aspects of our economy right now in terms of jobs? Well, for right now, those that are declared essential businesses are okay. So in Modoc County, you probably have grocery stores that are still open, other retail that's still open that might be food or pharmaceutically related, and some construction efforts that continue on, and some agricultural efforts. You may have a lot of businesses that are basically still working a little bit, if not, relatively normal. But at some point, when the economy turns, we're going to see how much actual overall demand is supported to keep those businesses still going. And that's really the critical factor, especially on the tourism side. So the biggest problem right now is that we're going into the natural tourism season, and your local restaurants, your local hotels, your local tourism attractions, your local B&Bs, your local VRBOs, all that stuff is now going to get very tested over the summer to see when we actually see the social policy change, will people travel? The cool thing about Modoc County, so there's a positive here, is that it's a place that people may want to drive to once they have the freedom to leave their home in terms of the social piece. And so there are some good economic development aspects I'm going to just talk about in just a minute that you can think about in terms of planning to turn the corner. Healthcare also is one that you might think is just booming right now, and it is on acute care, at least in a dubious sense. But for outpatient, elective surgeries, chiropractic, podiatry, things in which are not, let's say, acute care or essential medical services to sustain life, but are things that we do all the time as sort of tune-up measures with respect to our bodies, that's something to watch out for, that those doctors, those healthcare professionals otherwise may end up really thinking about whether or not they want to stay in rural California if they haven't had demand for 2 or 3 months. It may make them rethink keeping their practices open. And so that's something to watch, that even though we think healthcare is going through a pretty good time right now, it's not across all healthcare. Government's going to get tested big time because of the downturn in revenues over the last couple of months, and also this subsequent couple of months coming up. A lot of budgets are going to get tested not only this year, but also next year. And that can lead to a big change, as well as thinking about people that work for government. Are they going to choose to leave? And is that going to leave a shortfall in the people that can provide services from government? Government also may have to cut back on hours and have, every other Friday closed for a while just to cut down on costs. On the worker side, and this is especially true in rural California, in older populations, one of the things we're watching for are folks on fixed incomes. Are they going to be able to continue going forward? And you think, well, my fixed income is not going to get affected. We don't know that yet. So one thing to watch for is whether or not we have more conditions of hunger, people that are marginally homeless as a result of this, our migrant population that tends to come around during agricultural times and also during tourism and construction periods that may not be coming around because they couldn't afford to stay. We're testing a lot of labor market hypotheses in California based on how we normally run business, because this is so general in its effects in terms of COVID-19 on the economy. Okay, let's talk about forecasts on jobs. So looking forward, we think about, there's 2 scenarios that seem to be slowly coming to fruition in terms of economists looking forward, both for the US and for the California economy. I'm actually going to do this for Modoc County as well. In California, we've taken on similar measures as to China, and since we've sort of restricted economic movement, we're expecting a recession. Now, in the tricky scenario, I'm suggesting that might be relatively short, meaning it'll last maybe 3 quarters. And during that, we're going to see layoffs, we're going to see furloughs, and we're going to see some rehiring after that. So the key is that a short duration recession should bring back consumer and business confidence and should lead to rehiring. Critically there, we don't lose businesses. That's an absolute critical step in all this. If we lose businesses, that's where we're going to have big trouble, because that actually reduces our capacity to produce goods and services. The ugly scenario is where we actually have that and a whole lot more problem. The situation continues to be general. Job losses mount across the board. We don't come easily out of the social policy, meaning that's a very slow restart, and we struggle to get all the parts of our economy back together again because they're all linked to each other. I'll give you a simple example. You may say, well, doesn't really bother me about air travel in Modoc County. We don't see a lot of people fly in here. That's true. You don't have a commercial airport. But what you do have is you have a private airport, and you also have people who fly into Sacramento or fly into other parts of Northern California and then access Modoc County because they flew in. So you might be less affected by those changes, but you're not unaffected by those changes, and be very concerned about being short-sighted on that. The travel piece of this is absolutely critical to our economy getting back to where it was supposed to be. And we may see a structural change in travel no matter what happens otherwise. So if that ugly scenario comes to fruition, it also may include a redo of this episode, disease-wise. Sometimes I struggle to say that word, epidemiology. From that standpoint, we may see a repeat of the disease in the fall. So let's see what happens. Here's the 2 scenarios. Here's the baseline we start with. This was actually the Department of Finance's estimate early this year as to where we were going towards 2023. This is the tricky scenario. You can see the sharp downturn. Hopefully my mouse will show up here. You can see the sharp downturn here, followed by a relatively quick reclamation of jobs into the latter part of 2021 and into early 2022 before we're fully back to baseline. But baseline was actually pretty good. So if we get back by the end of next year or early 2022, given we're about 18 months from the end of 2021 now, we're going to say that actually is not a bad episode given everything that's happened. Here's the ugly one. And the ugly one you can see, sharp downturn, Then we go a little bit, and then there's a repeat performance because of what happens in the winter. And it takes us another year basically just to get back to where we fell. And then we're off for another year and a half, 2 years, just trying to get back to baseline. And this assumes that there's no additional issues capacity-wise, but the ugly scenario has this real big bad loss in it for almost a year and a half. So that's what we're kind of seeing at the California level. Now, if you map this onto Modoc and the way that usually has happened, and you can see the two previous recessions there, what the Great Recession looked like and getting blasted back to about 2015 jobs in California, here's Modoc in contrast. Here is the evolution of Modoc in the same timeline through 2023, based on Department of Finance estimates and then my own estimates. And here is the tricky and ugly scenarios. And the ugly scenario kind of starts at about 2,900 jobs in Modoc County, falls to about 2,570, 2,600, and then slowly marches back up. Notice, I do not have the second episode really affecting, even in the ugly scenario here, that much because of Modoc's rural geography. It is likely that Modoc County will avoid some of the broader aspects of a repeat performance because it's not an urban or suburban area. So we will see how much that plays out, but it should expect some downturn in the front end and hopefully avoid most of this and actually be somewhere between the black and the blue. We will see. You can see there's again the two recessions, and thinking about how Modoc County has worked in the past. That's why I have such a downturn initially, mainly because in both scenarios there was a pretty good downturn, and we want to watch for that. And that's where we're heading right now, at least in theory. Now, I talked earlier about doing what I called economic development around this and seeing some opportunities. So where's the triage going to happen? Where can we help the most now? We know there's going to be a shadow cast, even if we get loose from our homes and get back to something that looks like a more normally moving economy. It's in tourism that I've talked about a bunch of different times here today that we have to watch very closely. Will people be able to move in such a way that gets them back to their own spending? And furthermore, the amount of competition that's going to be out there for people to spend their money is going to rise sharply. So even if you believe that Modoc County, and it is a great place to come and a beautiful place to visit, especially in the summer, we're going to be watching very closely how competitive urban and suburban areas are who have lost billions of dollars in this episode in travel, come out with screaming deals to go there and try to pack as many people into those hotels as humanly possible. We will see. Unfortunately, you may also see some competition come out about don't go to places where there might be fires, come here into a city where the chance of fire is basically minimal. Watch for that kind of advertising as well. It might happen because of the desperation that's going to be out there on the open market. Our downtowns, our sort of cute old school downtowns are going to be under some threat because our merchants that populate those towns and assume that there's going to be some tourism flow, we may have some problems in that coming up this year. So where economic development locally can find its work, so the Alliance in helping out in Modoc County should be thinking about downtowns and what we can do there to help out our merchants. And what residents can do is buy local as much as humanly possible at this time, and that's a critical factor going forward. We're also watching housing and commercial construction. We think construction is going to be okay. One of the things about that is that if a lot of people lose their job, we might see more or less pressure, I should say, in wages, more workers available. We should have some pretty good deals on materials and appliances and things like that that might be renovation projects or more new construction. And interest rates are relatively low, but we just don't know what developers are going to want to do, or even residents are going to want to do in terms of renovation and redoing a home if they feel like their wealth and or their income is going to be affected by this in a, let's say, 18 to 24 month period. So you can give people all the incentives to consume as you want, but if they at the end of the day are feeling underconfident about where the future is going to go, they may not demand as many construction services, and businesses may not want to see as much commercial construction, or government may not want to see that either. The one place where we may see some benefit here is if the government of both the federal and state want to build more healthcare facilities and potentially more healthcare system manufacturing facilities for goods that are used in healthcare as a way to get ready for the next crisis. All parts of California may feel some positive aspects of that. We will see. If you are a public worker, if you work for the municipalities, one of the things we're watching is taxable sales are going to fall, no doubt about it. And as we go into tourism season, we already know TOT has fallen from what we expected because occupancy rates have been way down. So we're watching very closely for that in terms of what we actually see as the effect on our municipalities just from taxable sales. If construction slows down, how does that affect permits, fees, and other sort of non-tax revenues that we expect in our municipalities? Also, if we see housing prices fall, will we have another property tax shock like we had in 2008, 9, 10, and 11? That could be coming if home prices turn down quickly and if people leave the area. Now, the thing that's different this time maybe is that if an earthquake happens or if you have some kind of a fire and people don't want to be in that area anymore, they may leave and go someplace that's less affected. There's really not a place that's going to be less affected on this one, except for a few places around that may have had not as large an effect from the disease. But it doesn't mean they're not going to have some effect in their job markets. I said this earlier. It's going to be very tough to find an unaffected area in this setting. And some may pop up, but watch for that in terms of whether or not people up and leave Modoc County and or California as a result of this at a faster pace. We know there's going to be more social assistance demanded, so we're watching that. In older communities, we may see people ask for more social services on the other side of this because other incomes they have been hurt. So if you're on a fixed income, which may include what you're peeling out of wealth that you have, that wealth may have been hurt such a way that the income you can take from it is lower, which means your consumption pattern's lower and you may have to shift to social services. Watch for that, as well as our low wage workers asking for more services as well and putting more pressure on government to deliver. Finally, and this is something to watch for very closely, there's maybe a long-term impact here. So CalPERS, CalSTRS, and our other pension systems have got to be very cautious to watch how equity markets move and how suddenly you may see a lot more retirements happen where people want to lock in their benefits contractually while the getting is good, if they assume that those pension systems are going to make choices to reduce benefits, to reduce their costs later as annuitants go into the system. That'll be something to watch very closely in that we're as again, a public worker, I have a few people who work for me who intend to retire. Part of that is what's happened now because they want to lock in those benefits. Okay, start wrapping up. Let's look at taxable sales exposure. We just talked about some of the municipal and some of the business aspects of this. This is the evolution from 2009 on a quarterly basis in terms of percentage of total taxable sales that are retail and restaurant based. And in Modoc County, you can see it's relatively high. It's sort of waddled around 75% with a couple of episodic quarters. And this is California over that same time. So in theory, Modoc County, by the nature of it being a destination place or a place that does not have a lot of other additional industry, is somewhat more exposed than your average California county in terms of taxable sales downturns, specifically to retail and restaurant sales. So if those things contract, again, in a tourism-based economy, for example, you're going to have some pressure in your municipalities. Housing market's the other thing to watch. This is where we've been. So there really has not been any change in the housing data as of yet, but this is where we kind of started 2020. 1 year ago, I don't know, 1 year ago we had about little off, maybe flat pricing. 2 years, it's been a little bit flat too, but since the bottom, since 2010, that's why it says at the top since 2010, that since the bottom, about 77% of your housing prices have come back. So like the rest of California, which is here, Modoc County has seen ascension. In the last couple of years, while relatively flat, people have recovered or maybe have gained wealth by buying a home in Modoc County. Will we see a downturn in that wealth is an open question, but it's going to be something your businesses, your workers, and your governments are going to be watching very closely to see, can people stay in their homes and can businesses stay open to give workers a reason to stick around? Those dynamics are all interconnected. So watch very closely for all three of them moving. Okay, so to wrap up, some short-term indicators of change or things that I'm watching as an economist that you may want to watch also, just thinking of the things we talked about in this presentation looking forward. Changing the labor market to be the #1 critical aspect. Watching unemployment insurance claims. Are they rising? US has seen 22 million people in 4 weeks, and the new data come out tomorrow morning for last week, and it's probably going to be another 4 or 5 million people. Are we going to see 30 million people on unemployment, which is sort of in the range of 18 to 20% unemployment if everybody goes on unemployment and stays there? So in California, it's about 2.8 million. We'll find out tomorrow exactly how close it is to 2.8 million. It was 2.2 million in 3 weeks. I'm estimating it'll be about another 600,000 will go on the roll this next week. We'll see. But think about 3 million people in California, which moves our unemployment rate up into the same sort of realm of 17, 19% sometime in April. We're watching job openings to see if businesses start to say, okay, we think social policy is going to loosen up. We want to get ready to rehire. How many businesses are doing that, and in what industries? So that can tell us what industries are maybe foreseeing a relatively quick turnaround or not. And then the average hours worked, are we actually seeing productivity sag in such a way that even if we do have growth, the number of hours have slowed so much that it's not going to be that much productivity anyway in the short term. We're watching the caseload, and we're watching how summer's going to go. So locally, we're very concerned that the summer has some regularity to it, and hence the social policies getting lifted allows the local economy to function normally, hopefully by, let's say, the middle of June. There's a lot of indicators that suggest that will not happen. So for economic development, for the Alliance, you got to be thinking, what does that mean in terms of its effects on downtown, on the sort of concentric circles around downtown, and how a rural economy like Modoc, in a sense, depends on the small town downtowns as places to gather, but also just places that generate jobs and incomes. And the caseload is something that Modoc County has somewhat avoided, but it will not avoid the economic impacts probably in the end, just simply because of its dependence on the outside, like most rural California does as well. It isn't on an island, it's also reliant on the greater economy to not only bring visitors, but also to purchase whatever goods and services may be flowing out of Modoc County. And then finally, policy. Right now, it's more social than anything, but policy's meant once the social goes away to help. We will see how those policies work. You've got to talk to your banker. You've got to take advantage of all the benefits that are potentially out there. And that is really the economic and workforce development challenges in the front end, is what can we do to get people bridged over this gap in such a way that they have confidence going forward. So, Vicki, well, I guess we'll now take some questions if we have them. Folks, thanks again. And I want to thank the Alliance for Workforce Development for having me, and Chabin for sponsoring this as well. Vicki, please let me know when you are ready.
Okay, am I unmuted? Okay, I do have, okay, I'm unmuted. I do have a couple questions. If anybody else has questions, go ahead and use the chat feature to submit them, and we'll get Dr. Eyler to answer them. The first question is, do you think Modoc County, with the few incidents that they've had, could open sooner than the state of California? And I would add to that, do you think the recovery could be faster?
Yes and yes, with the caveat that on the front end, you probably want to make sure that your county supervisors are talking very closely with the governor's office to make sure that they know you're reopening in what ways, and that you're doing it in a way that looks like a similar path, but earlier than the state is planning to do. Because what they don't want to see happen, this is where it can get really nasty. We haven't heard this yet, but I think it's coming. On the federal side, I think the federal government is going to start using economic incentives to get the states to try to open earlier. And I think that states like California are going to resist that. And the economic incentives can also be economic disincentives. I think the state of California might want to provide incentives also for counties to stay closed until they think they're 100% ready. But you're right. It's possible, given the rural aspects of Modoc, that you could open earlier. I would just be very cautious in how you do that, in the sense that roll out in industries that make sense from a social distancing and from a gathering standpoint. Don't open all your bars and restaurants up and expect everybody to come flooding back in there, because one increase in cases is going to shut everybody back down again. And it's critical that we all understand that. It's not going to take that many new cases to turn into headline news because you rolled the dice and it failed. So be very cautious on that one. But I could see that you could do some of that a little early. Make sure you've got statewide clearance for that, and think about it very deeply from an economic development standpoint. But if you did it, you should get some of the benefits of opening earlier than other parts of California.
Thank you. The job charts that you showed in the last few slides ago, are these private sector jobs, or are they all jobs? And does that make a difference in the recovery expectations?
That's a great question. So it is actually just payroll jobs for all employers in Modoc County, not the people that are living in Modoc. So that's a critical factor, and it's a great question. So you may have a lot of businesses that are being run out of homes that are, in a sense, residents who are working and not on payroll employment. So there's incomes happening in Modoc County that don't have anything to do with, let's say, the classic job counts. But so those were the jobs. And it could be that the projections I showed would be somewhat dampened by that. But if we think about the industries that are likely to be affected, Modoc County should expect some downturn in the next few months, it may not be as sharp. And part of it is how you reopen and also the other parts of your economy that potentially support a quicker rehiring period.
Okay, great, thank you. Can you speak to opportunities with federal stimulus funding for construction and forest management projects? How can these opportunities be structured to maximize local benefit?
That's a great question. I think certainly if those funds are available, I don't know if the funds have been augmented in terms of forest cleanup or, let's say, federally derived construction efforts. I don't know that myself, but if they are available, it's probably time to start planning to utilize those, because as soon as the gates open up, if you have those monies ready to go, that would be a smart thing to do.
Okay, those are the only questions that I am seeing here. If you have other questions that come up, feel free to send them to your contact at Alliance for Workforce Development. They can forward them, or you can email me directly at vicki@chabinconcepts.com, and we will attempt to get those questions answered. I'd like to thank everybody and thank AFWD for sponsoring, and good luck to everybody.
Thanks, folks.
All right, thank you, Rob.